Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Harlots, Whores and Hackabouts, A History of Sex for Sale by Kate Lister. Narrated by Kate Lister. Introduction. Tales from Grope Cunt Lane. To sex workers everywhere, past, present and future. In the autumn of 1888, 5 women were brutally murdered in the Whitechapel district of London, England. Despite the best efforts of Scotland Yard, their attacker was never caught. Mary Ann Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly are now known as the Canonical 5, victims of the serial killer the British press nicknamed Jack the Ripper. Their murders were reported around the world and birthed an international obsession with their killer. In life, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine and Mary were unremarkable. Like thousands of Londoners living in desperate poverty, they eked out an existence on the margins of society. But in death, they attained an almost cult-like status in popular history, as countless historians, authors and amateur ripperologists have tried to unmask their killer. Every year, tourists still flock to Whitechapel to walk the same streets as the killer once did, take in a Ripper tour or visit the Jack the Ripper Museum. The Ripper is now part of British folklore, continues to evoke hackneyed images of dimly lit streets, swirling smog, a shadowy figure, and of course, the prostitutes that he preyed upon. The impoverished women who sold sex in the slums of Whitechapel are as much a part of the Ripper mythology as the killer himself. The Canonical 5 may be infamous, but they've never been real women to us. As the Ripper became legendary, his victims became little more than a sensationalist plot device in the story of their murderer. Despite hundreds of books, documentaries and websites dedicated to uncovering the identity of Jack the Ripper, the identity of his victims has never extended much beyond the effacing label of prostitute. They too have become caricatures, hiding in doorways, their faces drawn and pale, their lips rouged, hitching up their tattered skirts up past their ankles to reveal a flash of cheap stockings, calling out to clients in the broad cockney tones of old London town, and offering sex for the price of a jar of gin or maybe a night at the Doss House. The narrative demands that these women were prostitutes, in the same way it demands that their killer was somehow mysterious and extraordinary. But Hallie Rubenhall's recent research into the lives of the Canonical 5 suggests that only Elizabeth Stride and Mary Kelly earn their money by selling sex. The others, like many in the slums of Whitechapel, were homeless and earned their money through a combination of odd jobs, begging, borrowing, and pawning what few possessions they acquired. Rubenhall's claim fundamentally disturbed the foundations of the Ripper narrative and led to her receiving considerable online abuse from ripperologists, certain that these women were selling sex because of the poverty they endured. This hostility has laid bare an ongoing determination, both in their own time and today, to make these women stereotyped cartoon prostitutes in order to fit a more salacious narrative. The stigma surrounding sex work and sex workers has long blinded us to the reality of these women and others like them. Today, sex work is a diverse and complex experience, ranging from full-service sex workers to dancers, sugar babies, BDSM providers, and those selling photos on OnlyFans. All sell a sexual service, but few would call themselves a prostitute. Conversely, many Victorians comfortably labelled anyone selling a sexual service as a prostitute, as well as any woman living with a partner outside of wedlock. What is meant by prostitute can vary considerably, but however it is deployed, it is tangled in assumptions about a woman's morality and worth. The Ripper myth demands that these women are prostitutes because the label dehumanises them, makes them complicit in their own murders, and allows us to indulge our own interest in the violence inflicted on their bodies. We have assumed much about these women, but known very little. This is the history of sex work. Stereotypes, stigma, and sensationalism have obscured the lived experience of people selling sex throughout much of history. The stigma forced, and continues to force, many into silence, meaning the dominant social narrative around sex work has been constructed and deployed by lawmakers, moralizers, medics, and the media. Stereotypes of the unrepentant titillating whore or the tragic victim in need of rescue have long stifled the voices of those who sold sex. The very nature of sex work is, and always has been, to sell a fantasy. When we watch porn, for example, we see only the carefully choreographed final product. We see the actors, the set, and the make-believe sex. We do not see the camera crew standing around eating sandwiches, the multiple takes, the fake cum, or the discussions around consent and boundaries. The fantasy is the finished product, but it's never the whole story. This book invites you to move beyond the headlines, the sensation, and the stereotypes of sex work, and meet the people who made their money selling sexual services. Names, photographs, and historical documents are placed next to the history of harlots, whores, and hackabouts from around the world, to bring together forgotten faces, names, and lives lived in the shadows. Sex work is, and has always been, a highly complex experience that resists easy definition. From the temple whores of Babylon and the legendary courtesans of ancient Greece, to the hustling molly boys of Georgian London and the lob-lob girls of Canton, and the Winchester geese trading on medieval London's Gropecunt Lane, there is no one version of sex work. There are legion. Some made their name trading sex for fabulous sums of money. Others occasionally turned to sex work to supplement a low wage, a side hustle once known as dolly mopping. Many who sold sex lived and continue to live in terrible poverty and choose full bellies over empty platitudes of morality. Then there are those who didn't choose at all but lived in sexual slavery. All traded fantasy and sexual favours, and all faced varying levels of abuse and social stigma. Quite how much stigma various groups have shouldered has historically been dictated by money and class. The wealthier the client, the less stigma involved. The glamorous diamond-studded courtesans and professional mistresses of the medieval and Renaissance European aristocracy, for example, not only commanded respect, but many wielded considerable political influence over their besotted clients. Royal mistresses were so powerful, many were referred to as the power behind the throne. Agnes Sorel, the mistress to King Charles VII of France in the 15th century, was one such woman. The king officially designated her the royal mistress in 1444, the first woman to be officially recognised as such in France, and heaped her with wealth, castles, and lands. However, King Charles also passed laws that required girls and women of ill repute in France to be rounded up and made to work in municipal, state-approved brothels, or face being expelled from their hometowns altogether. The women in these brothels lived as virtual prisoners, while the state made a tidy profit from their earnings, money that went to line the coffers of the king, who in turn handed it over to his own woman of ill repute. Throughout history, authorities have fretted about how to best deal with those who want to buy or sell sex, moving through various stages of repression, toleration, legalization, control, moral outrage, and abolition before circling back again. History is littered with various efforts to prevent sexual exploitation by abolishing sex work. None of them have worked. Torture, mutilation, fines, imprisonment, banishment, excommunication, and even the death penalty have all been deployed at various points, and none have succeeded in abolishing the sale of sex. Nor have these punitive measures ended sexual abuse. All that happens is consenting sex workers are forced to work in dangerous conditions and are further stigmatised for what they do. And those who are abused become even harder to find. One of the central mantras of the modern-day sex worker rights movement is stigma kills, and with good reason. In 2000, Canadian professor John Lohman analysed descriptions in the media of efforts to abolish sex work by politicians, police and local residents, and identified a discourse of disposability. Lohman linked this with a sharp increase in the murders of street sex workers in British Columbia, Canada, after 1980. He argued that, It appears that the discourse on prostitution of the early 1980s was dominated by demands to get rid of prostitutes from the streets, creating a social milieu in which violence against prostitutes could flourish. This is how stigma works. Once the sex worker is stigmatized as less than or disposable, a message formed, shaped and deployed in debates around morality and abolition. This discourse then influences how sex workers are treated. We can see this rhetoric at work throughout history. Draconian laws and harsh punishments against those selling sex reinforces social stigma, which enables violence to flourish. This book uncovers the history of people who have bought and sold sex. But abolishing the ongoing stigma around sex work is everyone's responsibility. It is said that sex work is the world's oldest profession, but this is not true. In cultures without money, there were no professions at all, and little evidence of prostitution, though doubtless sex has always been a useful commodity in one way or another. It was Rudyard Kipling who first coined the phrase, the world's oldest profession, in his short story, On the City Wall, 1898. The tale opens with the immortal line, "Laloon is a member of the most ancient profession in the world." The expression has since fallen into common parlance as historical truth. But perhaps what Kipling wrote after these words offers even more insight into what is at least a very ancient profession indeed. In the West, people say rude things about Lalan's profession and write lectures about it and distribute the lectures to young persons in order that morality may be preserved. How we write about sex work, indeed how we think and talk about it, matters. It might not be the oldest, but as this book and many others show, it is a very ancient one. Its workers are deserving of rights and respect, of being genuinely heard and seen rather than stereotyped in silence. It's time to move beyond the fantasy. It's time to look, listen, and learn. Chapter 1. Sex in the Ancient World. In Service of the Gods. When she has had intercourse, she has fulfilled her religious obligation to the goddess and will return home. After this, you will not be able to give her any amount of money, however great, with the intention of seducing her. Herodotus, Histories, 426 to 415 BCE. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and glittered with gold and jewels and pearls, and she was holding a gold wine cup filled with the disgusting filth of her prostitution. Revelations 17:4. The British people are no strangers to bad weather, but even by their standards, 1872 was a very wet year. It was, and remains, one of the wettest years since weather records began in 1766. Rivers burst their banks, chalk cliffs in Dover gave way, crushing the houses below, and ships were wrecked in the ports of Liverpool, Plymouth, Swansea and Portland. Throughout November, heavy thunderstorms pealed above the City of London. To those sheltering in the capital's doorways and public buildings, it must have seemed as if the second flood had come. And for one unassuming man, watching the rain fall over Russell Square from the second floor of the British Museum, in a manner of speaking, it had. 32-year-old George Smith spent much of 1872 indoors, hunched over thousands of shattered clay tablets that archaeologists had sent back to London from Nineveh in modern-day Iraq some 25 years earlier. Carved into the clay fragments was cuneiform script dating back to 1800 BCE, and Smith was one of a handful of scholars who could decipher its meaning. Piecing the ancient fragments back together, Smith had found forgotten Hebrew monarchs, ancient prayers and Assyrian laws. But that November, as the rain beat down, an astonished Smith deciphered a story about a flood, of a boat stranded on a mountain, and of a bird sent to find dry land. It seemed to Smith, and many others, that this was an independent account of the biblical flood found in Genesis. Overwhelmed at his discovery, the usually reserved Smith began shouting, whooping, and running around the room. Later accounts claim that he was so beside himself that he started to take his clothes off. Smith had unearthed what would become known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, circa 1800 BCE, one of the oldest works of literature in the world. Of course, he did not know this as he danced around the second floor of the British Museum, nor could he have known that the Flood tablet was but one of 12 that contained the legend of Gilgamesh, king of Arik. Smith would go on to piece all the fractured legends back together and translate them for a new audience. All except for one. The legend of Shamhat, the harlot, is the earliest surviving story of transactional sex in the world, and Smith simply couldn't bring himself to tell it. Instead, when he published his seminal The Chaldean Account of Genesis in 1876, Smith discreetly omitted the 19 lines of the poem that describe Shamhat's sexual encounter with the wild man, Enkidu. The story Smith tried to hush up tells of how the great goddess Aruru created Enkidu to equal King Gilgamesh. Enkidu lived in the wild, among the beasts. His body was covered in long hair, he grazed on grass with the gazelles, and he drank at the waterhole, his heart delighting with the beasts in the water. Upon learning of a man as mighty as a rock from the sky, Gilgamesh ordered that Shamhat the harlot find Enkidu at the waterhole, strip off her raiment to reveal her charms, and do for the man the work of a woman. Obediently, Shamhat goes to meet the wild man, and she does as her king bid her to do. Shamhat unfastened the cloth of her loins, she bared her sex, and he took in her charms. She did not recoil, she took in his scent. She spread her clothing, and he lay upon her. She did for the man the work of a woman. His passion caressed and embraced her. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu was erect, as he coupled with Shamhat. After their week of frenzied lovemaking, Enkidu finds that he is no longer wild. He has reason and understanding, but the animals now fear him, and his strength is greatly reduced. Shamhat has civilized Enkidu through sex. This part of the Gilgamesh epic was not fully translated into modern language until German scholar Arthur Ungenard did so in 1911. The question of what Shamhat can tell us about the buying and selling of sexual services in ancient Mesopotamia continues to fascinate scholars. George Smith and his conservative contemporaries may have been aghast at Shamhat, but that's evidently not how she was intended to be read. Shamhat is powerful, respected, magical, and may even have been considered sacred. This possibility opens up one of the most contentious areas of historical research, the practice of so-called sacred prostitution in the ancient world. Sex work is indeed one of the oldest professions, and there is ample evidence of a thriving sex trade in ancient Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi dates to 1754 BCE and contains several laws pertaining to the regulation and protection of sex workers. If a man's wife does not bear him a child, but a prostitute, car kid from the streets, does bear him a child, he shall provide grain, oil, and clothing rations for the prostitute, and the child whom the prostitute bore to him shall be his heir. As long as his wife is alive, the prostitute will not reside in the house with his first-ranking wife. Legal protection and state regulation of sex work is found throughout the ancient world. The Athshatra of Kautilya is an Indian text on politics that was composed sometime between the 2nd century BCE and the 3rd century CE. The Athshatra devotes a chapter to discussing the duties of the Ganikadyaksa, the superintendent of courtesans, and details rules for women in this profession. Sex work was regulated by the state, and sex workers paid taxes each month. A Ganika was appointed by the state to attend the king and receive a salary of 1,000 parnas every year, whereas Bundhaki worked in the brothels and Pumskali worked on the streets. The Athshatra uses the word rupyiva to describe a woman selling sex, which translates to one who makes a living out of her beauty. Clearly then, as now, sex work was a complex and densely layered experience, ranging from the destitute to wealthy courtesans. But were those who sold sex ever regarded as holy? Did women like Shamhat sell sex in service of the gods of ancient Mesopotamia? The character of Shamhat is central to this debate, and there are many who argue that she is a sexual priestess, as she is associated with the goddess Ishtar throughout the epic. After spending a week making love to Shamhat, Enkidu turns to her and says, "Come, Shamhat, take me along to the sacred temple, the holy dwelling of Anu and Ishtar, where Gilgamesh is perfect in strength." But what did Shamhat and her fellow harlots do in Ishtar's temple? How did they worship this powerful goddess? Did they pray? Were they temple priestesses who sold sex to Ishtar's devoted disciples? Or did they simply solicit for clients at the bustling temple? Ishtar, or Inanna in Sumerian sources, was an extraordinarily powerful goddess associated with war, fertility, and sex. Many scholars have linked Ishtar to sacred sex, and there is some evidence to support this. The Akkadian word used to describe Shamhat in the original story is harimtu. The Sumerian equivalent is kakid, and both have been translated to mean harlot or prostitute. But these are modern labels, and they bring with them layers of meaning that speak more to our own time than to that of ancient Mesopotamia. Precisely what harimtu, kakid, meant to those who once worshipped in the temples of Ishtar is far less clear. On one ancient clay tablet, Ishtar identifies herself as a loving harimtu, while another surviving tablet from the ancient city of Nuzi describes a woman, Utubalti, being pledged to the temple and service of Ishtar. Kakid has even been translated by some scholars to mean one who knows the penis. But all this really tells us is that Ishtar and her followers were associated with sex. Whether or not goddesses like Ishtar were once worshipped through transactional sex will continue to draw intense debate. But what is beyond doubt is that many of history's most prominent scholars believed that this did happen and were suitably shocked at the very thought. Over 2,300 years before George Smith bowdlerized the harimtu from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and some 2,333 miles away from the British Museum, another historian recoiled in horror at the prospect of sacred sex in Mesopotamia. When Herodotus wrote his magnum opus Histories between 426 and 415 BCE, he intended to tell the story of the Greco-Persian Wars of 481 to 79 BCE. What he produced was an epic 9-book overview of the entire history of Persia, its people, its practices, and its prostitutes. Cicero called Herodotus the father of history. Unlike many fathers, Herodotus could be judgmental, stern, and rather prone to exaggeration. Herodotus travelled widely throughout his lifetime and writes with the authority of an eyewitness. His account of Babylon, the cultural capital of ancient Mesopotamia, certainly carries all the gravitas and certainty of a man who's been there. So when Herodotus claimed Babylonian women sold sex to worshippers in the temple of Aphrodite, his words were accepted as fact. He writes, "Many women who are rich and proud and disdain to mingle with the rest drive to the temple in covered carriages drawn by teams and stand there with a great retinue of attendants. But most sit down in the sacred plot of Aphrodite with crowns of cord on their head, passages marked by line run every way through the crowd, by which the men pass and make their choice. Once a woman has taken her place there, she does not go away to her home before some stranger has cast money into her lap and had intercourse with her outside the temple. But while he casts the money, he must say, 'I invite you in the name of Melita.' It does not matter what the sum of money is, the woman will never refuse, for that would be a sin. The money being by this act made sacred. So she follows the first man who casts it and rejects no one. After their intercourse, having discharged her sacred duty to the goddess, she goes away to her home." We owe the first extant description of Babylon to Herodotus, and for centuries his work was an authority on Babylonian history. It was not until the early 20th century excavations of Babylon, led by German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, that Herodotus's account was called into question. In fact, there are so many errors in his description of Babylon that many modern scholars have concluded he could never have been there. For example, Herodotus claimed the city had 100 bronze gates and a wall that was 100 metres, 328 feet high, and 25 metres, 82 feet thick, but no evidence of this could be found in the city itself. Likewise, his claims about sacred sex in the Babylonian temple of Aphrodite could not be corroborated by any archaeological finds. But a good story is a good story, and Herodotus's description of Babylonian women selling sex to anyone with a shekel in service of the goddess of love proved to be extraordinarily influential. 400 years after Herodotus, the historian Strabo describes ritual sex practiced at Alcilazine in Armenia. Here, citizens honoured the Persian goddess Anaitis by instructing their daughters to sell sex in her temple before they were married. In Didaea Syria, 2nd century CE, the Greek writer Lucian of Samosata describes a ritual practice in Syria where young women had sex with strangers as an offering of worship to the goddess Aphrodite. The Augustan historian Gnaeus Pompeius Trogus wrote, "There was a custom among Cyprians to send their virgins to the seashore before marriage on fixed days, for employment in order to get dowry money, and to make a first fruit offering to Aphrodite, a dedication to preserve their virtue in the future." Stories of the sacred harlot of Babylon can be found scattered throughout ancient texts. There are rumours and flashes of her everywhere, but she wriggles free from the historian's grasp as soon as anyone feels they have her. But maybe what we have been looking for never existed to begin with. When George Smith silenced Shamhat in the Gilgamesh epic, he did so because his culture viewed transactional sex as immoral. Smith lived at a time when prostitution was euphemistically referred to as the great social evil. His understanding of what a prostitute was dictated by specific social scripts that framed her as wretched, fallen, and outcast. Little wonder, then, that Smith simply could not accept this pathetic figure as sacred and revered. Likewise, when Herodotus writes about temple sex, he is expressing cultural bias rather than simply reporting. The stigma around transactional sex continues to shape public opinion, and modern narratives surrounding sex work continue to draw on discourses of disposability, victimhood, rescue, and contagion. So pervasive is this narrative that many people simply cannot believe that anyone could choose to sell sex. The very word prostitute is burdened with the weight of stigma that limits our understanding of those who sell sex. How then can we begin to understand the religious and sexual practices of the harimtu in the temples of Ishtar, when our own views of those who sell sex are so stigmatized? The most tangible evidence of sacred prostitution is the 800-year-old Hindu tradition of the Devdasi in India. Devdasi means female servant of God, and in southern India they are women dedicated to serve the goddess Yelama, as they have done for hundreds of years. The earliest written records of dancing temple girls called Devdasi date to 1230 to 40 CE, from the time of Rajareya III in Maharashtra. A 1,000-year-old inscription in Tanjore temple lists 400 Devdasi in Tanjore, 450 in Bradhaswara temple, and another 500 in Somnath temple. Devdasi looked after the temples, sang and danced in devotion to the deities. They were also courtesans and supported by wealthy patrons who sought out the Devdasi because they were sacred women. They dazzled the courts with their poetry, music, and devotion to the goddess. Sex was part of their world, but it was incidental. They celebrated art, beauty, love, and the divine. When the British colonised India, they brought with them their rigid worldview and were unable to see the Devdasi as anything but prostitutes. So repulsed were they by what they saw, the British set about shaming and dismantling the Devdasi institution. In 1892, the Hindu Social Reform Association petitioned the Governor-General of India and the Governor of Madras to erase the Devdasi. There exists in the Indian community a class of women commonly known as Notch girls, and these women are invariably prostitutes. The British missionaries taught India what a prostitute was and why it was so shameful. Support for the Devdasi disappeared. They were socially shunned and stigmatized, cut off from patrons and the temple.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?